Good morning. I'd like to thank you for joining us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. This past week was special for us as Trista and I got to celebrate 5 years working with the Greenbrier Church. And one of the things that I've enjoyed the most over the last 5 years is our association with our Hispanic congregation. We have a Hispanic minister, Cristobal, that does a great job, and even though I only know a little bit of Spanish, on Sunday, he helps our English-speaking members and our Hispanic members greet each other and just express our love and concern for one another. We also have some other wonderful bilingual members who fill in those gaps when communication gets tricky. You probably know that talking to people who didn't grow up speaking your native language can be tricky at times. There are pronunciation issues that sometimes come across as laughable. For instance, a couple weeks ago, somebody came to the building looking for Cristobal, and I tried to tell them that he was at his house, but instead of saying casa, I said casa. And they looked at me and kind of smiled and said, "What's he hunting for?" It took me a minute to figure out that I had misspoken. There are also times around our building where someone will pause and they'll look at you and say, "I'm not really sure how to say this in English." You understand there's a language barrier that we all face because we don't all understand words and what they mean the same way. Several weeks ago, we began a 3-on-3 series. We said we're going to look at faith for 3 weeks and hope for 3 weeks. And today we're going to get into what Paul says is the greatest force of all, and that's love. And while love is one of the greatest ideas in every culture and every language, there are times that we get a little confused about what love really is. Much like our conversations with our Hispanic brethren, sometimes we think we're talking about the same thing, when in reality we're having two completely different conversations. Love's a verb, and oftentimes we want to soften it into an emotion. Now, I'm not against emotions. I believe that God hardwired us to be emotional beings. We experience a wide range of emotions, from burning anger to warm affection. Our emotions are used at times to motivate us to do some pretty heroic things, but they can also cause us to do some pretty petty things. People spend thousands of dollars every year trying to figure out, how do I deal with these emotions? And even though our emotions can be problematic, I don't know anybody that would choose to live their lives without emotions. My college roommate was a huge sci-fi fan. He watched everything from Doctor Who to Star Wars. One of his favorite shows was the original Star Trek series. And so there were days that I would come in from class and he'd be on the couch watching it on TV. And so I've seen a few episodes and I've picked up a few things. I remember there was a character named Mr. Spock, and he was from the planet Vulcan. And one of the defining characteristics of people from Vulcan was that they didn't have any emotions. And I know that there are some ladies right now thinking, of course he didn't have emotions, he was a man. But can you really imagine living like that? I mean, I wouldn't want to give up experiencing the joy that comes from a pleasant sunrise any more than I'd want to give up the sadness that comes from a crushing disappointment. There are some things that are worth being sad about. To tell you the truth, I can't think of a single emotion that I'm willing to give up. I wouldn't want to live without anger, because there are times that we need anger. Sometimes anger is the only thing that gives us the courage to stand up to injustice or oppression. But I wouldn't want to give up sadness either, because without sadness, you'd never fully be able to experience joy. As necessary as they are, however, our emotions, even the positive ones, are not the same thing as love. You cannot command an emotion. If I had all of the authority in the world, and even if you recognized my authority, I can't command you to feel a certain way. If I were to order you to be sad, you might be able to fake it. You might be able to fake a tear or two, but there's no way you can force yourself to truly experience the emotion of sadness. But yet, all throughout the Bible, we're commanded to love. Maybe you remember the time when the gentleman walked up and asked Jesus, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God and love the people created in his image." Jesus wasn't telling them or us how to feel. He was telling us how to act. God doesn't just tell us that we need to love, He tells us what it looks like, how love behaves. In the New Testament, there are several beautiful, lengthy descriptions of love. We've been spending a lot of time in 1 Corinthians 13, and I don't want you to get so familiar with it that you turn on autopilot. So this morning, I want us to look at Romans chapter 12, where Paul describes what Christian love is and what it isn't, what love does and what it doesn't do. He does this masterful job laying the groundwork. In Romans 12, verse 2, he says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." God's called His children to be different from the world around us, and maybe we don't fully grasp what God's calling us to do. You see, I grew up and I was taught that if I don't drink or smoke or gamble or hang out with women that do those things, then I've succeeded in being different from the world. But no one seemed overly concerned about the values and the attitudes that I held and if they were different or just like everyone else's. Paul says we're supposed to do more than just act different. We're supposed to be different, to think different, because we're guided by God's love in all that we do. So Paul writes in Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 9, "Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Don't be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless them. Do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If it's possible, so far as it depends on you, live peacefully with all." There's an awful lot going on in this passage, and this morning I want us to work through what Paul is saying. I want to see if we can come up with some practical, everyday ways in which God expects us to show love in all of our relationships. We need to remember that love is an action. More specifically, love is a sacrificial action. Paul's describing what we need to do to show that we love other Christians, but even more importantly, how we love non-Christians. So let's work through this list really quickly to see what we need to be doing to show love. And Paul starts by saying love should be genuine. Of all the things that he could have started his description of love with, he intentionally says love must be sincere because, well, that gets to the heart of why we do what we do. Love isn't so much about how I feel about you, but rather what am I willing to sacrifice for you? And we need to be careful here because real love is more than just going through the motions. There are a lot of different reasons why I might do something good in your life or for you. But if I have an ulterior motive, I'm not acting in love. I mean, I might be acting out of my own best interest, or I might be acting in order to gain an advantage or for you to owe me a favor. And that's not love. Paul alludes to this in 1 Corinthians 13 when he says, "If I give away all that I have, but have not love, I've gained nothing." I believe it's important that we always check our motives because hypocrisy is driven by this desire for other people to have a false impression of us. Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, "So when you give to the poor, don't announce it and make a show just to be seen by people." There were a lot of people in Jesus' day who were doing nice things for other people, but it's not because they loved them. It's because they were hypocrites. They wanted people to get this false impression of who they are, to think highly of them. So before Paul begins talking about what love does, he says, check your motivation. Make sure you're acting out of genuine concern for the well-being of others. Paul knows that it's pretty easy to go through the right motions to appear loving when there's no love in our heart. And so we need to be sincere so next we can see that love puts others first. Usually when we think about a competition among a church family and their members, it's not a pretty thing. Maybe you've had the unfortunate experience of living through the ugliness of competition that causes a division in the church, members trying to be the greatest in the kingdom and outdo one another. But here Paul invites us to a healthy competition. He invites us by laying down this challenge to make it our ambition to do better than everyone else in showing honor. Maybe some of you hyper-competitive folks can use this as an incentive. But for most of us, it's going to be kind of difficult. You see, the normal attitude in the world is, I'm going to put myself first, stand up for my rights, and do what benefits me the most. Paul says love puts others first. We're supposed to set the need of others ahead of our selfish interests. Love prompts me to serve others, assigning my interest a lower priority than your needs. And that's exactly what we see in the life of Christ. Jesus was never interested in what would benefit him the most. Rather, he was willing to sacrifice everything so that we could get what we truly needed. Paul says, be like Jesus. God calls us to put others first, to outdo showing one another an honor, which is important. Because when we do that, then we understand that love is ready to serve. Have you ever noticed that sometimes we're reluctant to do things for other people? I mean, we only want to help people out when it's convenient or when we're in the mood. If somebody needs our help, we think, I really just don't feel like doing anything right now. Paul understands that, but he knows that genuine love is zealous. It's eager to do what it can to help others. There's this story about Jesus in Mark chapter 7 where he's been out spending the entire day healing people, preaching, teaching, ministering. At the end of the day, he's tired. He wants to find a house where he could just hide away for a little bit and get some rest. But it doesn't take long for this woman to find him. This woman's daughter is possessed by an evil spirit, and she's standing outside the house begging Jesus to come help her. Jesus is experiencing the same exhaustion we've all felt. Yet because he's zealous for good works, he goes outside to help the woman's daughter because that's what love does. Genuine love is always ready to serve. A love that doesn't shut itself behind locked doors where it can't be reached. A love that's eager to serve is what Paul's calling us to do. And then Paul teaches us that love is generous and hospitable. In the early church, you see a lot of Christians doing this. In the book of Acts, you find the Christians in Jerusalem selling their possessions to help one another, to help other Christians in need. In 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about the fact that the church sent money to help the poor Christians living in Jerusalem. The attitude throughout the church seemed to be, if I have it and you need it, it's yours. Hospitality was such an important quality in the early church, and there was a time when I was little growing up, the hospitality was important in the life of the church as well. I mean, I can remember as a small child, we were always at someone's house or somebody was always in our home. Almost every week, we were eating and spending time with another family at church. And then somewhere down the line, we bought into this normal American view that my home is my castle and it's reserved exclusively for my own pleasure. I don't want people in my personal space. So Paul's reminding us that's not really your home. That house belongs to God. You're just supposed to be managing it and using it as a place of encouragement for others. True love is generous. True love is hospitable. We get to this point, and Paul's instructions haven't been very easy so far, but they're about to get a whole lot tougher because in verse 14, he says that love speaks well of its enemies. Paul's repeating what Jesus says, and one that I find myself struggling with the most. You see, if you were to ask me, I would tell you that I have a certain level of spiritual maturity. I mean, I've learned to control my actions. When somebody treats me poorly or gossips about me, I might think about punching them in the nose, but I don't punch them in the nose because I'm a mature Christian that loves Jesus. I mean, I've got pretty good self-control, right? But what do we say when we're mistreated? I mean, what's your response when somebody wrongs you or wrongs a member of your family? I would imagine that if you're like me, your first impulse is to say something derogatory about the person that wronged you. You may say it back to them, or more than likely, you might say it to somebody else. You talk about what a terrible, horrible, no good person they are. Paul says that not only do we not curse the people that persecute us, we're to bless them. We're supposed to respond by saying something good about them to other people, and that's difficult because it's not our normal. Let me remind you one more time, God did not call us to be normal. We're not called to be conformed to the world, but to be transformed. We're supposed to be like this guy that I heard about who worked with another man named Joe. Joe was always putting this guy down, constantly saying bad things about him. And one day somebody asked this man how he felt about Joe. The man said, well, I think Joe's a great worker. He's honest, he's energetic. And the other guy said, really? Are you aware of all the horrible things, terrible things that Joe is constantly saying about you? And the man said, well, yeah, I'm aware of it, but you didn't ask me how Joe felt about me. You asked me how I felt about Joe. There's a difference there, isn't it? Love always speaks well of our enemies, and love is empathetic. It's really easy to be happy when you're with other happy people. I know there are a few times that we get jealous and it gets difficult because they receive something we thought that we should have, but usually we're happy with people that are happy. But love not only rejoices with those who rejoice, we weep with those who weep. I think all too often we just apply this to our relationship with other Christians, and that's important. But I don't know that that's primarily what Paul had in mind here. I mean, he puts this instruction immediately after he told us to bless those who persecute us. So maybe he's talking about how you deal with people that are your enemies. That's tough. I mean, we're not all that different. For example, imagine you're driving down the interstate, right? And somebody comes up behind you, they're going about 90 miles an hour, and they swing over into your lane, and you have to hit your brakes because you don't want them to clip your front bumper. Well, that agitates you, right? How do you feel a few minutes later when you're driving down the road and you see that same car pulled off on the side of the road with a state trooper behind them writing them a ticket? Be honest, you have a little bit of joy, don't you? You might even want to pull in behind the state trooper and tell them how he's been driving bad for a long, long time. There's a part of us that likes it when bad things happen to people that have done us wrong. That's the normal response. But once again, Paul says God doesn't call you to be normal. He calls you to be like Jesus. Rejoice with our enemies when something good happens to them. Send them a note and say you're glad to hear the good news. If some tragedy comes into their life, don't say it serves them right. Go weep with them. Love is empathetic, especially with our enemies. And then Paul says that love tries to make peace. Milton Jones writes in his book, How to Love Someone You Can't Stand, according to Paul, you must do more than win the war against evil. You must also win the peace. Winning a war and winning peace are not always synonymous. The battle is not over if peace has not been achieved. Just because the conflict has ended doesn't mean that you've reached your objective. The goal is to have you and your enemy getting along in a good relationship. I've been chewing and struggling with that quote for quite some time. It's not enough for the conflict to be over. A Christian's ultimate goal is to have good relationships, to be at peace with those that we're in conflict with. But let me draw your attention to the stipulation that Paul places on the instruction. He says, live peaceably with men if it is possible. I mean, sometimes it's not possible. But if we're not at peace with others, it cannot be my fault. We must do everything we can to live at peace with others because love always makes peace. And finally, Paul says that love doesn't try to get even. The urge to get back at somebody for the way that they've treated us is a normal, natural impulse. If somebody does you wrong, it's natural for you to want to return the favor. And once again, let me remind you, God doesn't call you to be normal. He calls you to be like Jesus. it's very likely that someday, for some apparent reason, somebody's going to make the decision not to like you. Maybe it's something you did, maybe it's something you didn't do, maybe it's something you can't help. Suddenly you're going to find yourself in hostile territory. We're being called to resist the natural inclination to get even because God's calling us to a higher standard. In another part of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, if you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? If you are kind only to your friends, how are you different from anyone else? Jesus saved us so that we could live a life that is different. Everybody loves the lovable, but you've been called to be different. When you learn how to love the people that don't love you, when you love the unlovely, when you bless the people that curse you, that is when you demonstrate a life that is not normal, a life that can only be explained in terms of God living in you. And so as we close our time together this morning, we close where we began. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The way that you transform your life is you fill it with true, sincere love. And that love will lead you to do some things that are pretty strange by the world's standards. This morning, as we make our way to the tables, we're faced with a choice. We can either choose to live our lives just like everybody else in the world around us, or we can choose to be transformed into the image of God, doing things that aren't easy. In fact, doing things that are sometimes downright painful. You see, loving others doesn't always lead them to love you in return. I mean, just ask Jesus about that. His answer is going to be found in the bread and in the cup. But it does lead us to be a people who reflect the love of God our Father and draws people to Him. And that's the whole point of the table. And that's the whole point of our lives. Jesus didn't die on a cross so that we could receive His forgiveness and continue to live like the world. We receive the forgiveness, the love, the grace, the mercy of Jesus so that we can be transformed in our mind and in the way that we love. And so this morning, as you go to the table, I hope and pray that you have a good time of conversation talking about what it means to live an intentional, sacrificial life of love, the life that you are called to, a life that is only possible when the Spirit dwells in you and you have transformed your mind to be like God. It's difficult, but it's not impossible because it's what we were called to be. I hope this week you begin to think about how can you be more serious about your Christian walk. What is it going to take for you to believe, actually believe enough to live out, to strive to live the words written in this text? I believe it'll make all the difference, not only in your life, but in the life of your family, the life of your church, and the life of our community. After all, that's what it means to be the light. Have a wonderful week. Have a great time around the table. Always remember that you're loved, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.